When you learn about the history of Egypt, everyone always talks about the big triangles, Ramses, Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, some kid whose tomb never got robbed, and then finally Cleopatra, at which point Egypt just ceases to exist for the next 2,000 years. Or at least, that's what learning about Egyptian history always feels like to me. All about the pharaohs and the pyramids, but never about Roman Egypt, or the Mamluk Sultanate, or the entire existence of Cairo, or even how the land of the pharaohs became the country we see today. So what happened to Egypt after it became a Roman province? How did the rise of Christianity and then Islam transform Egypt, and what did Egypt look like in the Middle Ages? This video is made in partnership with Paradox Interactive for the upcoming release of Europa Universalis 5. Now, my usual go-to nation in EU4 and now EU5 is the Mamluk Sultanate. So, in honor of EU5's impending release, I thought I'd take a deep dive into what was happening in Egypt up until the game's start date of 1337, and what history had in store for them over the next 500 years. Whether you yourself are interested in playing as the Mamluks, or you just want to learn about some history. This also means I'm stopping the clock at the 18th century, because if I were to also include everything that happened after 1800, I'd probably have to spend like 2 months on this video. So that's a story for another time. So where most histories of ancient Egypt probably left off, Queen Cleopatra VII had just died, ending the Ptolemaic dynasty that had ruled Egypt for the past 300 years, and considered by Egyptologists to be the last dynasty of ancient Egypt. But what happened after it was absorbed into Rome? Even during Cleopatra's final years, Ptolemaic Egypt was a very different place from the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms, something which would become even more apparent as the former center of the universe became just another province in a much larger empire. Yet even then, with trade routes growing to connect further flung parts of the known world, Egypt found itself at the center of these trade routes, connecting Europe to India and East Africa via the ports of Alexandria and Berenike. Being at the center of so many intercontinental trade routes, Egypt became something of a melting pot between different cultures, and most particularly, religions. Along with the native pantheon practiced here for millennia, the Greek and Roman religions also had a sizable impact. Egyptian cities also had sizable Jewish communities, but the most consequential religion to come to Egypt at this time was Christianity. Egypt was one of the first places Christianity spread, with the Coptic Orthodox Church of Alexandria dating back to AD 42, which makes geographic sense, though Christianity itself wasn't so fond of the ancient Egyptian religion. The multiple gods thing was one thing, but that one story of Pharaoh enslaving God's chosen people didn't exactly leave a positive taste in early Christians' mouths, resulting in a degree of cultural distancing between contemporary Egyptians and their pagan past, something which would continue as Egypt grew to become a thoroughly Christianized region by the 5th and 6th centuries. Ever since the two powers first came into direct contact 700 years earlier, Rome and Persia repeatedly fought over their mutual border. So long that Rome versus the Parthians became Constantinople versus the Sasanians, fighting over a border that didn't really end up budging that much. In 618, something actually happened on this border, when Egypt was taken by the Sasanians, something which would reverse 10 years later after the two powers reached a settlement. Those 7 centuries of on and off fighting never actually did much to change the border, but they were super effective in wearing both empires down, becoming easy pickings if a third power were to enter the stage. Pfft, where's our new power going to come from? The Arabian Desert, they both said. And then a new power came from the Arabian Desert. A new religion had united the tribes of Arabia into one rapidly expanding empire, or a caliphate, which by 640 was knocking on the doors of Egypt. With Constantinople's Egyptian garrison restationed to a more defensive position in Syria, the Rashidun general Amr ibn al-As swept through Egypt, taking the fort of Babylon, not that Babylon, later that year, and then the capital Alexandria in 641, beginning the age of Islamic Egypt. Egypt obviously needed a capital, and while Amr wrote back about the splendor of Alexandria, the city that had been Egypt's capital for the past 1,000 years, Caliph Omar demanded, quote, "When I travel to you from Medina, my horse must take me to the place I join you," which basically ruled out anywhere west of the Nile or anywhere he had to cross water. Luckily, there was this one fort that Amr had taken off the Romans' hands on the eastern banks of the Nile, so he just built a city right there, which would be called Fustat. Just like the religion that prompted its existence, Fustat grew incredibly quickly in its first 100 years, growing to more than 200,000 people. The one nearby city that wasn't so lucky was the ancient capital Memphis. Memphis had been in basically continuous decline ever since Alexandria was founded, and with all the attention split between the seaport of Alexandria and the new administrative center of Fustat, all that would prove to be the final nail in the sarcophagus for Memphis, as stone from the ancient houses and temples were slowly scavenged to build a new city. It would take another few years after the initial conquest to bring Upper Egypt fully into the fold, as it was historically the Delta region of Lower Egypt that was the first to adopt a new culture or religion. I think it's quite telling that the last Egyptian temple, closed in 537, was located all the way down here, south of Aswan, which kinda tells you the direction change usually happened in. Despite that, Islam and the Arabic language took the country by storm, with Arabic gradually replacing Greek and Coptic as the language of government and day-to-day life. See my What Happened to the Ancient Egyptian Language video after this one's done to learn more. Don't watch it now, watch it later. Jews and Christians, or Dhimmi, were still allowed to live in Egypt of course, though like in other parts of the Islamic world, they had to pay a tax known as jizya. Well, if you're not paying zakat, you're paying something else. Whereas those worshipping the ancient gods, well, that wasn't really a thing anymore. The Rashidans came and went, then the Umayyads stayed for a bit longer but were themselves replaced by the Abbasids, who managed to hang around for much longer, though not necessarily in Egypt. In 868, a group of non-Arab slave soldiers known as Mamluks created the Tulunid Emirate, after their founder, Egyptian governor Ahmad ibn Tulun. The Abbasids would regain control over Egypt in 905, but in 969, a Shia power known as the Fatimids would come in from the west, taking North Africa and Hejaz off their hands. That same year, General Johar would establish a new city to house his 100,000 troops, literally just northeast of Fustat, which he would name the Victorious, or Al-Qahira, which would become known to English speakers as Cairo, eventually encircling the older city of Fustat until the whole thing was known as Cairo. This time around, Cairo was not just the capital of Egypt, but of the entire Fatimid Caliphate, ruling everywhere from Algiers to Amman. The Fatimid era was something of a golden age for art and learning in medieval Egypt. Fustat became a center for pottery, metalwork, and glasswork, while Cairo grew into an important cultural and intellectual center, most notably in the founding of the Al-Azhar Mosque, which would grow into the modern Al-Azhar University. This period, however, also saw a breakdown in the idea of there being one caliph, with the Abbasids still proclaiming their own caliph in Baghdad, and the Umayyads, exiled in Spain these past 200 years, having also started doing the same thing a little earlier. While the Fatimids had a goal of uniting the entire Islamic world under Shia Islam, their rule saw a period of religious tolerance for Sunnis, as well as Copts and Jews. The Fatimids also made heavy use of a certain kind of slave soldier called Mamluks, who were brought to Egypt everywhere from Central Asia to West Africa. Keep an eye on these people, they'll be important in another couple hundred years. While Egypt was attacked by crusaders throughout the 1160s, it was General Salah ad-Din, or Saladin, who put an end to the Fatimid Caliphate as part of a Sunni reconquest, beginning the Ayyubid Sultanate. The 12th and 13th centuries were an incredibly turbulent time for the Middle East, with Sunni and Shia rulers vying for dominance alongside the rise of the Seljuk Empire, in addition to the Crusaders coming in from the west and the Mongols approaching from the east. Within this messy situation, the Mamluks had become the kingmakers of Egypt, with their support becoming instrumental to any Ayyubid sultan's claim to power. Saladin's great-nephew, Sultan as-Salih Ayyub, utilized Mamluk forces in claiming the throne, awarding many of them important positions in his council. However, after the Seventh Crusade took the city of Damietta, as-Salih executed 50 of his Mamluk commanders as punishment for this defeat, something which the Mamluks predictably weren't particularly thrilled about. After as-Salih died in 1249, his son Turan Shah took power, promoting his Kurdish soldiers to power, which proved the final straw for the Mamluks, who assassinated him Julius Caesar style at a banquet. Since the death of as-Salih, Egypt had technically been ruled behind the scenes by his widow Shajar ad-Dur, who the following year would marry the new Mamluk Sultan, Aybak. There were two groups that would rule the Mamluk Sultanate, the Bahris until 1382, and then the Borghis until the Ottomans came in. They're often called dynasties, but that's a bit of a misnomer, as the crown wasn't always passed down to the Sultan's son, or any relative for that matter. They were more like clans, with the Bahris being those Mamluks trained on Rhoda Island, not to be confused with Rhode Island or indeed the original island of Rhodes, and the Borges referencing the tower, or Burj, in Saladin Citadel, northeast of Cairo. The Mamluk government was very similar to what it had been under the Fatimids and Ayyubids, with Mamluks serving in many important government positions. Only difference now is that by many positions of governments, I actually mean all of them. This, however, had the unfortunate side effect of making Mamluk leadership quite aloof to the problems of the everyday Egyptian people, as Mamluks were by definition not from Egypt, and those in power often spoke Circassian or various Turkic languages. That's not to say the Mamluk era was a dark age in medieval Egyptian history. I mean, this was probably the most long-term stable government Egypt had gotten since the Fatimids. However, there was another threat rapidly advancing from the northeast. No, not the Mongols, that was last century. This time, it was the Black Death, which had reached Egypt by 1347. The exact number of people Egypt lost is hard to know for certain, but if we're to trust Al-Makrizi, it was a lot. Quote, "The country was not far from being ruined. One found in the desert the bodies of savage animals with buboes under their arms. It was the same with horses, camels, donkeys, and all the beasts in general, including birds, even ostriches. Cairo became an empty desert, and there was no one to be seen in the streets. A man could go from Zuwaylah Gate to the Bab al-Nasser without encountering another soul. The dead were so numerous that people thought only of them. The devastation brought on by the plague and its aftershocks was so great that Egypt's population wouldn't fully recover until the 19th century. Part of why Egypt took so long to recover was due to the centralized power structure of the Mamluk Sultanate. Basically, you know how after the plague, European serfs being fewer in number effectively led to the end of feudalism in Western Europe? Yeah, well, those same pressures did not apply to how land was held in Egypt, with absentee landowners refusing to release peasants from their rental obligations, leading to a further decline in Egyptian agriculture and arguably weakening the country against any potential invaders. This is what the map looked like in 1516. And this is what it looked like literally 1 year later, the Mamluk Sultanate completely swallowed up by the rapidly expanding Ottoman Empire. The Egyptian Mamluks were allowed to remain in power, though in 1522 they teamed up with dissatisfied Ottoman soldiers to try to break away from Constantinople. As you can probably tell by the fact that you've never heard of this rebellion, it was quickly quashed by the armies of Suleiman I, later known as the Magnificent, who sent his vizier Ibrahim Pasha to gently rearrange the legal and military structure of Egypt, in order to stabilize the Ayolet's government and get the gears of its economy turning again. Once more, Egypt became an important source of grain and Nubian gold for the empires they were a part of, transforming the Ottomans from an empire on the rise to an Afro-Eurasian superpower. Egypt was now ruled by an Ottoman governor. However, throughout much of the 17th century, the Ayolet was divided between two Mamluk factions, the Fakharis and the Qasimis, whose dramatic rise to power forced virtually every Egyptian tribe, class, and individual to pick a side. This constant competition among the houses ate away at Ottoman control over Egypt, but something that certainly didn't help was the introduction of the iltizam, which was a kind of tax farm that had been common elsewhere in the empire, but its introduction in Egypt led to decreasing agricultural productivity, as farming taxes became more profitable than farming. The turn of the 19th century proved a dramatic shakeup for Egypt's governance, economy, and even its ancient history, with Europeans becoming absolutely obsessed with ancient Egypt, much like myself circa 2009. Napoleon's failed conquest of Egypt eventually led to Muhammad Ali Pasha consolidating power over the Ayolets, establishing Egypt as an autonomous province within the empire and passing many reforms which dramatically changed the country. Egypt's history in the 19th century is also an incredibly interesting story, but one I'll have to save for another time. This video is already going on long enough, and I'd like to be able to save some time to explain this stuff in detail. So, subscribe and click the bell icon to stay tuned. Once again, big thanks to Paradox for sponsoring this video and letting me playtest EU5. It's a grand strategy game where you manage your own nation from 1337 up into the 19th century, and they've gone crazy in depth with different mechanics like population, military power, economies, trade, really putting you in the shoes of these rulers to see why they made the decisions that still shape our world to this day. The game is coming out November 4th, and Paradox has put a bunch of us history YouTubers together to spread the word. Paradox have also been really great sponsors, so it would mean a lot to me if you checked out EU5, as well as the other videos in the collab.